All right, good morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Nicholas Thompson. I'm CEO of The Atlantic, and I will be the moderator today. We are doing two things. We're having a conversation about innovation, where ideas come from, when things go awry, and we are taping episode 10 of the Moonshot Podcast, a podcast about moonshots. Episode 1 came out just this morning. I listened to it on 3x speed. I have no idea what it's about. So, let's get going with this conversation. We have amazing people on stage. We have Katie Kwan. She is a robot choreographer at Stanford. We have Adam Savage, a famous special effects designer. Savage Industries tested the guy who taught my children to blow stuff up. And we have Astro Teller, who has the best job title in America, captain of moonshots at the Moonshot Factory. Hello, how are you? Let's get going. Astro, I would like to know, you've been running the Moonshot Factory for 15 years. What is something that you've always wanted to build that has always been a little bit out of reach? You can't do it, you start, you stop, but maybe one day you'll get there, but not now.
There are an enormous number of things that we haven't gotten to yet that we sort of circle around, but maybe a fun one, since we're going to talk about prototyping, is something it's really hard to prototype till you have the materials. We looked in the very early days at making a space elevator. And the problem with making a space elevator is you can't just like make one that's a foot high and then 2 feet high and 3 feet high. Like at some point, the thing that's difficult about a space elevator is it goes from being like heavy going that way to heavy going that way, right? It's like you're swinging something really big around like this. It's pulling out.
And space elevator takes you from where to where?
A space elevator would be a very, very, very strong strand. Think of it as like the world's strongest string that goes up so high into the sky that it stays up, not because it's stiff, but because it's being pulled outwards. It's being whipped around like a string. The problem is that the strength to weight ratio you'd need to have is hundreds of times that of steel, because it would be too heavy, there'd be too much mass to hold it. And so you need to make it out of something like carbon nanotubes, but you need to make like dozens, hundreds of miles of it so that you could then literally have an elevator go up into space instead of having to have a rocket.
So that's the thing that's just out of reach.
That's one of the things where we haven't quite gotten to prototyping it yet.
Amazing. Adam, same question for you.
I mean, you know, I was lucky enough to have my failures on television for 13 years. But honestly, that was one of the most fun parts about making the show. You know, to me, the thing I'm always interested in is science communication, is getting people to understand something. And for me, understanding comes on a physical level. Excuse me. Understanding comes on a physical level.
Actually quite nice, actually. Physical level. Poof.
I like to say I can't understand a concept until I know it in my body. And that is just a process of sort of layering in information. I have been working on a dramatic representation of the two-slit experiment for years. I love the idea of getting people to a place within a theater environment of not like, I didn't understand that before. I want to get them to a place of, I didn't know I could understand that. And there are aspects of talking about quantum physics in which you're no clearer at the end about what the hell's going on, but there are vistas that you can see. And as a science communicator, I'm like ever seeking those kind of vistas to talk about.
I mean, that's my goal for this conversation. Have everybody completely confused at the end, but have like brief moments of insight and commitment.
I think that is the goal of any great conversation.
Katie, why don't you respond to Adam's theory that you really know something's coming when you can feel it? I would imagine as a dancer and a robot choreographer, you have deep views on this matter.
One of the interesting things about being a human is that we have evolved to know how to dance. So our brains have this skill called entrainment. It's the ability to pair rhythm and motion, and you can do it from the time you're just a few months old up until a couple years. So everyone who always tells me, like, I'm not a dancer, I'm like, you are, actually. Your ancestors in thousands of years. And why I think that's important is because our body-based visceral experience of society and how we interact with each other is truly one of the things that makes us uniquely human. And it's why our capacity for abstraction when it comes to storytelling also applies to our capacity to design and generate tools that we've never seen, heard of, thought of before, because we can abstract to this physical level of like, what would it mean for my body to be in relationship to a new kind of machine, to a new elevator, to a new way of constructing and putting objects together. So I think our unique human ability to be able to dance and to express motion inside of our environment is actually something that translates very well to our unique human ability to leverage the things that are in our environment to make new kinds of tools that never existed.
Wait, so when you think about teaching robots to dance, are you thinking about that as you're trying to understand how humans will exist in a future world? You're trying to help robots that will exist in a future world?
All the above. I mean, something I say on the podcast is that there's going to be billions of robots in our lifetimes. That's actually not insurmountable. I mean, we have robots that exist in so many different ways now. We can't even project forward what kinds of robots there will be in the world. And when you have billions of robots that you're surrounded by, that's a choreographic problem, because now you have new things that are moving around you that you've never experienced, and you don't have thousands of years of evolution of your ancestors studying trees in the wind or squirrels on the ground to know what that motion means. It's brand new motion that you've never seen before, and it's motion that's being generated by a machine. So I think choreography has a huge role to play when it comes into our future world with robots, them understanding us and us understanding them.
Makes good sense. All right, Asher, let me go to something that Katie kind of brings up, which is when you think about the future, you're not just thinking about what you bring into it, but you're thinking that everything that changes around it. So when you think about something like a space elevator, it's dependent not just on whatever you can invent, but also what other people are inventing, right? And so you have to be able to project not only, well, can we build the carbon nanotubes? Can we figure out the power to weight ratio? But also, will somebody else solve these problems? How do you think through that nexus?
Sometimes, if you have a theory of how the world is changing, even if you're not changing it, you can skate to where you believe the puck will be. That's a risk you can accept as you're building something. So let's say the world was making carbon nanotubes and the sort of doubling time on how much you could have for $1 was like 3 months, and you had a theory for why that was going to continue for the next decade or two. Then, okay, we'll start making the great glass elevator that we're going to strap on to this thing, and we're just going to trust that the manufacturing will sort itself out. Like, that's not a theory we have, but we could have that. And that happens all the time in innovation. It's very rare that you have all of the parts yourself.
Right.
So you have to have a theory. So, for example, one of the axioms that we have at X, that we're sort of constantly watching these trends, is it's really hard right now to take almost any kind of garbage and turn it back into treasure profitably. But when you look at landfills, they're all of our garbage, like all of this processing, all of this money we spent on stuff we wanted, and then we're like, we're kind of done with it. We don't know how to turn all of the leftovers here back into treasure. There is no way, once we get good at each of the little pieces, that owning those landfills won't turn out to be massively valuable. I'm using this as an example. We're not in the landfill business, but we're definitely watching where all of the leftovers go, because we believe that in the not too distant future, being able to turn trash back into treasure is going to be a really big deal.
And I did pick up something in the podcast I listened to at 3X this morning, which is that Waymo would not have worked had it not been for all the revolutions in AI. Was that something that you saw when you were laying it out? Did you say, okay, well, AI is going to improve at an exponential speed in a couple of years, and that it will make this simpler?
We were counting on some combination of Moore's law and improvements in algorithms. We didn't know exactly how fast it would go. But one of the truths is it feels right now like AI just went crazy to most people. But if you stand back and look at the sort of 70 years of artificial intelligence, it's an exponential that's relatively smooth. I mean, yes, there are some stair steps in there, but it's not like we were just flat and then things went bonkers. So yeah, from 15 years ago, we were trusting that some progress would have been made. It's probably true, more progress was made during those 15 years in artificial intelligence than we predicted, and it turned out we really needed it in order for Waymo to be as successful as it's been.
Yeah. I also want to point out, like, Waymo is doing so much of its mileage in my neighborhood of the Mission District in San Francisco, and I ride this one wheel, so I present, I think, a unique target to their vision system. And when Waymo was first traveling around the Mission and I would be crossing a street, I'd see the Waymo stop 45 feet away and be like, and now they're just nuzzling past me like any driver. And that's been a really quick thing to watch as a pedestrian.
And one of the interesting things about Waymo kind of relates to what you were saying about robots and dancing, was just we're trying to figure out just what Adam was talking about. Okay, so how do you understand how to navigate in the world where there's a physical object that used to be controlled by a human and now is an autonomous object? How do we relate to it? How do you think our relationship to cars is going to change, for example?
Making meaning out of movement, right? Like, actually at Stanford, there were a couple of design researchers who were working with autonomous vehicles, and they're like, what kinds of decelerations read friendly to people? Like, what kinds of accelerations read not aggressive jerk car, but like kind, knows where you are, safe car? And these types of things are so subtle, but they reach, our brains because we've evolved to notice different kinds of meaning in all the motion that we see.
What kind of deceleration do we think is friendly?
Maybe
like,
I
it's
can
not
model
the
it for you,
grandma.
but this
No,
is an
so
audio
here's-
podcast. Yeah.
Here's an example. I think everyone who's driven has that experience where you're trying to tell people as you're going to merge into traffic.
Yep.
Can I go?
Yeah,
Can I
right.
go? I'm starting to go. No, I'm serious now. So you're trying to use your car
Yeah.
as body language, and you're trying to read their body language to figure out when they believe that you're going to go enough that you can actually safely go.
Yeah.
The Waymo cars have had to figure out, I mean,
Right.
deceleration, acceleration, all of this like body language of what do you intend, the car itself has to start to learn to express that.
I would also much rather be driven by a kind, benevolent grandma Waymo car than an aggressive 19-year-old newly licensed driver car. So, like, as we build more character and personality and features into these machines too, it gives us a landscape of design options. We need to be deliberate about which ones we choose in which context.
Do you think they should always be based on human prototypes, human types that we're familiar with, or do you think we should be inventing better types of humans? Like someone with the sort of generosity of a grandma, but the perception of the 19-year-old?
I'm here for this future.
Yeah.
I think like an interesting amalgam.
What kind of
best-
ride do you want? It's
Right.
a button you choose.
Yes, exactly. And then the playlist, I have to say, I love the Waymo playlist, but I love that I can choose from the Waymo playlist
Right.
because often that is not the case when I'm driving in other people's cars.
So I rode a bicycle in New York City from 1985 till I left in 1990. And I rode like 10, 15 miles a day, every day. And there's a video that just went up of someone doing a speed run across Manhattan. And it brought all this feeling back of that specific frame of consciousness you need to live while you're riding a bicycle in New York City is being able to spot the troublemakers by their car's body language. And I mean, I know that back in the 80s, I could spot from half a block away the guy making a left 3 blocks from now because you get attuned to all of that language.
And they're watching the bikes. Did you ever read that study that cars in New York drive closer to cyclists who are wearing helmets?
Oh, no way.
It's totally.
That
it's-
is fascinating.
It's 100% true, or at least this study was out there.
Terrible.
All right, let's talk about failure for a little bit, since that's one of the things that is key part of the Moonshot Podcast, and you fail a lot. Astro, tell me how your philosophy of failure has evolved over the last 15 years.
So I just want to be clear, as sort of one of the crown princes of failure, though arguably I've got the king sitting right next to me. So for one of the very first times in my life, I feel like I'm sort of like second or third in line.
Thanks, I think.
I hate failing. It's not like I like failing, but I want us to succeed in the long run so badly that I'm willing to give up any amount of short-term uncomfortableness in exchange for that. And I believe that when you're taking moonshots, you are shooting over the horizon. It means you don't know where you're going. You often don't even know why you're going there when you get started. You have a thesis, but you're usually wrong. You're probably headed in the wrong direction. And so speed is not the value. It's learning that's the value. And if learning is where all of the value is going to come from, then the tightness of your learning loops is entirely what determines your efficiency. And you do not learn, none of us learn when we're right. At best, you are upping the ante on your current success behaviors, at best. You learn because you have some model of the universe, and then you get some piece of data that your model of the universe was wrong. And whatever else we call that, that feeling kind of sucks. And so let's be honest about that. Let's call it failure. And we all, to some extent, avoid those moments because they feel sucky in our stomachs. And that means we're avoiding learning. And so I want us to destigmatize failure. Not because I like failure, but because I'm obsessed with tightening the learning loops so we can win in the long run.
So you want people to be comfortable with failure so they actually succeed?
Yes. And so destigmatizing failure starts with acknowledging that failure is an inherent part of the process. And if you are embarrassed by it, if you have any shame, you'll start to unconsciously avoid it. And all that does, it does not speed up getting to success, it slows it down.
And your question, you have to fail on your way to success. I mean, the question is funny because there's a dichotomy between those two things, but what you're saying is there is no dichotomy between those two things. I'm famous for saying failure is always an option, but my phrase in my head is failure is intrinsic.
Right.
To any iterative process. And if you're not doing it, you're not iterating correctly. You're not iterating in a way that's useful.
Also, to categorize something as a failure, you have to have a notion of what success is. And I think when you're so ambitious that you don't even know what success could look like, it's hard to categorize anything in the interim as a failure. Plus, if you're not failing, or at least giving yourself the option to fail, you're not playing on the edge. Like, no great engineer or artist wants to say, I know the piece I'm going to make, and it will be exactly this, and it will work every time the first time I try it. That's not compelling. It's not fun. And it also doesn't keep you stimulated in this world where we're always playing at the edge.
All right, so we all like failure, we all agree on failure, but Astro,
Sounded like a big
That was a big
coming.
paintbrush right there.
there have to be moments. There's somebody on your team, right? You have all these people, they're off in these beautiful labs in this wonderful building, and it's all very fun and collaborative, and they're working on something, and they think it's gonna work, and you think it's not, and you're the boss, and you have to tell them that it's not. How does that go?
So imagine, Nick, that you work at X. If we get to the place where the thing that you're doing is definitely not going to work and you're totally in denial about it and I have to talk to you about that, we have already lost. You should know 100 times more than me about the thing that you're working on. So way before we get to that point, I would want us to be spending some time together where I get to say to you things like, look, your time is worth as much as my money is. Life is really short. And we're allowing you to go on these unlikely adventures, but there is a very explicit deal, which is your intellectual honesty. Are you down to go on an unusual journey with us, an unlikely journey with us, in exchange for practicing that dispassionate assessment of how things are going? Are you up for that, Nick?
It's wonderful, and you've definitely turned my question around where I was trying to put you in a hard situation. It made me feel emotionally uncomfortable because I'm imagining myself disobeying you.
But I'm really serious. That's the deal. It doesn't make sense for us to ever start on robots that sort of learn and hang out among us, or space elevators or anything else, unless we understand that deal. So I actually see my main job as helping to coach you so that by the time we get there, you're ending your project. I'm not ending it.
Have you ever had a moonshot where the person ended it and you all agreed, it's probably the right decision to end it, this wasn't going to work for whatever reason, and then 5 years later you saw somebody else build it?
For sure. So we deeply believe that false positives, where we think something is a moonshot, and then it later turns out that it wasn't, those are enormously expensive. We can spend a lot of money on those,
right.
And so like tears at the end of that journey. A false negative, where we think it's not a moonshot, we stop it, and later it turns out it was free, because we didn't spend any money on it. And so it's only expensive if you believe that there's a shortage of problems for us to work on. I don't. Sadly, I think humanity has more than enough problems.
And we create new ones all the time, so the market's expanding.
Also correct. And We're not shy on ideas, not just at X, but like humanity has no shortage of ideas. So if problems are plentiful, and it's equally plentiful, cool new ideas to go run at those problems, it's free to stop an idea. It's okay if somebody else makes a moonshot.
And if you're making like a new kind of laser gun, how do you know that your hypothesis is wrong? When do you stop and start over?
I think of it as a physical process. The process of iterating to build intuition into your system, so that I've been experimenting with something long enough to understand how it might respond. I get to some conclusion with it. I really think of it as an embodied physical kind of knowledge. The most important moment that happened for me on Mythbusters is in the very first season. We're 6 months into filming. The show's been airing for 4 months, and it's a hit, which is a very strange kind of noise to exist within.
Yeah.
And we're filming, will a penny thrown from the Empire State Building kill you when it hits the ground? And
Will it?
Oh, have you never heard this story?
We're hearing it.
6 people died. That's the failure.
There is a myth, and if you grew up in New York like I did, everyone says it. If you throw a penny off the Empire State Building, by the time it hits the ground, it's going so fast it'll go through you and the ground.
Okay.
And it's not true. And in fact, there's a wonderful NASA technician who oversaw their vacuum drop tank who did all this beautiful math on the fact that a penny is a tumbling object, and it tumbles between 2 terminal velocities, which is unique it makes it somewhat unique. And I had done a piece to camera on the observation deck of the Empire State Building about this, and I was flying home thinking, as a viewer, I'm not sure that I want to just hear about math. Like, I feel like I want something more physical out of that. And this was the first time in making the show I had a point of view about how I was narrating an experience. And so I thought, okay, wonder if someone's made a wind tunnel. I guess I would need a wind tunnel with 2 terminal velocities in it. And if I got them right, the penny would oscillate in there. And the process of spending a couple of days drilling holes in a plexi tube and then dropping a penny in and watching it go up and down, there was the reinforcement endorphin rush from the hypothesis being matched by reality is something that felt like it cracked the world open to me. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question.
No, it's a wonderful answer. So what happened is you realized that in kind of a weird way, your initial success, you'd finished the episode, it was presumably good, was a failure. You needed to do it a different way, and then you started almost over? So what did the final episode look like?
The final episode that was part of the very beginning of the episode was, if a penny has 2 terminal velocities, let's watch it and let's talk about what that means. And so then we built once we knew that a penny had a very top terminal velocity of 70 miles an hour, we built a gun that shot a penny at that speed, and Jamie shot me in the ass with it.
Wonderful.
QED.
That was where I was hoping the answer would go. Katie, is there a difference in how you think about failure in art and the way you think about it in engineering?
There's a theory, I don't remember who came up with this, that anything that is physically possible in the universe, we should be able to accomplish as a species with infinite resources of money and time. So if you can say that a space elevator is literally physically possible, which it sounds like it might not be, depending on the properties of steel.
It's just too expensive, right?
It's just too expensive, that you could accomplish that if you really set the right number of people and time to it. And I think, actually, when I was working at the Moonshot Factory, I was the artist in residence at Everyday Robots, which was a big moonshot robotics learning project at the time. We were doing the first multi-robot machine learning project that we'd done at X, or at Google, I think, because we had the most robots of anybody. And also painting this picture, back in 2021, 2022, everyone thought that we were crazy for doing like robotics and machine learning. People were like, that never works. And now here we are in 2025 where everyone's like, if you're not doing machine learning robots, you're behind the curve. So this is a perfect example. As an artist in residence there, I had no idea what I was gonna build. All we knew was that we wanted to teach these robots to flock together like groups of animals, so that you would observe these beautiful motions with robots, but that it would also be interactive with people, so you could perform gestures. And so it was this bridge project where it was mostly engineering. I was writing software almost all day long, but it was very artistic. We wanted it to give you an emotional, evocative feeling. And our first approach, we spent 9 months using reinforcement learning to train these robots in simulation how to flock together in groups, which I will not tell you how painful that was, but there was so much suffering involved. And that first approach, we realized we could spend another 9 months and probably get this to work. But if we changed our approach, given what we've learned, we could now get something to work in probably a month or two. And that is what we did. So would I call that a failure? I think it was more based on our learning loop. Now we needed to switch to a new modality. As an artist, though, I'm sitting there thinking, we're now back at zero because we basically have, like, I don't even have the sensation to work with. So I think those two different learning loops of like how quickly you can iterate on the engineering side such that you have something to react to as an artist, they don't always work in tandem, but you need them both, and you need them to synchronize at some point so that it feels like a success on both dimensions, since the work that I do is always engineering and it's always art.
Well, can I ask a meta question maybe for you and Astro? Why does X have artists in residence?
The rationale, there's a kind of a long story how I
Not that they shouldn't, but that I think there's probably an interesting answer why they do.
So I'll say this kind of top line view, which is that when you're trying to do something that's never been done before, you need to approach those problems in ways that have never been approached before, which means that you need an interdisciplinary group of thinkers and minds to perturb your existing sets of patterns. And especially we were trying to build robots that billions of people were going to interact with. When that happens, just like when you took computers out of a research facility or a military facility and you stuck them in everyone's pockets, you got human-computer interaction, linguistics, semiotics, all of these other fields that salted and peppered on top of what was kind of traditional computing. And we had the exact same theory in robotics, that when you took robots out of the factory, out of the research facility, all of these new domains, like choreography, were going to be relevant to the future of robotics. And that if you approached robots the exact same way that everybody else had done it, you were not going to get a new outcome. And so in order to facilitate a different kind of internal Cambrian explosion, you needed an interdisciplinary team.
I'm not going to say it better than that. I would just say, think about how thoughtful that was. Like, why would we not have artists in residence? In fact, I will go so far as to say I would say everyone at X should at least be partly an artist in residence. Everybody. And so to have a few people who are professional at stretching their thinking and stretching everyone else's thinking, like, man, I can't even imagine us trying to do it. If we were all coming from the same place, we would do nothing important.
But you
exactly like Katie said.
No, my favorite quote on this is William Gibson, who says, if you want to know where a new technology is headed, look at what the artists and criminals are doing with it.
Yep.
Well, and since we don't want to be the bad guys, like, I guess it's the artists we're going with.
Well, are criminals in residence more expensive than artists in residence?
Maybe he has the criminals in residence.
I think Adam's penny experience.
I'm not piecing out. Look, I want to also mention that we keep on making this distinction that engineering and art are somehow different poles on a spectrum. And I think we all understand that an artist, I think we have a cultural ideal of an artist as a kind of intellectual or emotional hunter, looking for gathering something together out of the ether, whether it's written or physical, and trying to communicate something of their experience through that. I think that's also a great description for invention and engineering.
Exactly.
In fact, I like to point out that science is the practice of going out to the edge of the known and reporting back what we can find to better understand our universe. And that is also what any artist is doing, is attempting to communicate their experience and share what it is with others so that we understand how it all works.
Let's talk a little bit about where good ideas come from. So Astro, let me start with you here. There's a hypothesis, I think it's called like the adjacent possible, that a lot of the best inventions come, you're in a lane, and it's the lane that's one step over from where people are. It's something that most people haven't thought about, but it's next to what you're doing. It sounds like you have a more, like a broader perspective, that maybe it's 2 lanes over, or 3 lanes over.
Sure, I mean, let me start with, there are 2 people, no one asked them to do it, but there are 2 Xers who about a year ago started a talk series at X called The Adjacent Possible. It's like, that's how much, like, bottoms up, grassroots, we're committed to this kind of thing. It's literally the name of it. Amazing. But yeah, I think when you don't know where you're going, when you're often trying to figure out what the question is and not just what the answer is, you have to quickly try these pairings of, is this a problem we want to solve? Yeah, that sounds about right. Okay, how would we frame this problem in a way that lets us take a run at it? Because, if you don't like waste, you could say, let's make everything so that it never turns into waste. That is a frame. Or then there's a very different frame that I was giving earlier, which is, hey, there's all this waste sitting there. Let's figure out how to turn waste into treasure. Those are both legitimate frames, but you have to pick one of the frames. Then once you have a fixed frame on a specific problem, then you can propose a solution. And this solution, this radical proposed solution, this science fiction sounding thing, you have to also be able to say, and here's a way we could test that, some kind of technology that gives us at least a tiny chance of testing it. Even when you have all those things, all you have is a moonshot story hypothesis. But that's good enough for you to start banging on it. And the answer, once you start banging on it, is usually, wait, we got the problem wrong, we got the solution wrong, we got the technology wrong, and that's okay. And then you start iterating with all three of those things until you either say, oh my God, we found something really important here, or we're totally lost, let's stop and start over.
Are you starting with the problem, right? The problem is there's too much waste. Are you starting with the opportunity? Okay, wait, there's all this stuff in the, no.
It could be easy. If you worked at X and you showed up at my door and you said, I figured out how to make a frictionless surface. Awesome, like so freaking cool. I'm a nerd, so let me see.
Yeah.
And not a moonshot story hypothesis. You haven't said what you want to do with it. But let's not throw your frictionless surface away. Let's ask the question, are there problems in the world that could be meaningfully addressed using your frictionless surface? I don't know. But I don't like war, but that's also not a moonshot story hypothesis. You have to have a proposal for how to fix it before it's something we can really bang on. But I don't care where we start. As long as we have all of the pieces that make a hypothesis so we can bang on it coherently.
Let's stay with this frictionless surface. Have you ever had someone just invent something crazy that you didn't have a use for that you then applied somewhere else? You either said, hey, wait, look at these folks trying to solve the transportation problem. We've given you a frictionless surface. Or has it ever worked that way?
Sometimes. I mean, usually, yes, but indirectly, right? Where the good idea happens, the interesting thing happens, we don't know what to do with it, and then it sits on the shelf for a while. So I'll give you an example. Someone just said, this is at X, I find it offensive that a dissolved CO2 sensor in the ocean, if you want to see how much CO2 is in the ocean in a particular place, it costs like $30,000. They're like, why? Why would it cost $30,000? So they made one that, if you manufactured a lot of them, would cost about $1. And then we're like, okay, that was worth doing. I bet you that's going to be useful for something, but we don't know what to do with it. It's still sitting on the shelf. At least a few dozen people at X know it's sitting there.
Well, now 250 people know. Does anybody need a CO2 sensor for the ocean?
Right. We couldn't figure out how to turn that into a moonshot, but I'm not sorry we spent a little bit of time and made that thing.
But look, there's this moment in Steve Martin's autobiography, Born Standing Up, in which someone says to him early in his career, you will eventually use everything you have ever learned. And I think we've all had the experience of hearing about an engineer who had some other hobby that ended up being a linchpin for a discovery. You're talking about institutionalizing that. It's like X has also learned how to ballroom dance as well as do engineering.
Right, we call it moonshot compost. Now often when we say moonshot compost, we actually mean we built something pretty substantial. It had to stop, we decided to stop it. But the people, the patents, the code, the partners, it's all still there in the dirt and it can come back. But sometimes it doesn't make it all the way to a moonshot with a name. It's just this sort of like raw material. But even so, we would call that part of the moonshot compost.
That's really good. I love that term.
Picasso has a beautiful quote on this too, where he made a little sketch on a paper napkin in a restaurant at one point and handed it to someone and it was like, oh my God, I can't believe you made this in 30 seconds. He goes, no, it took me a lifetime. This is the summation of the entirety of my experience, of everything that I've learned, of the culture that I've built, and yes, what happened in this infinitesimal moment of me passing you this paper napkin is so much a reflection of everything that you've ever learned.
Here are all my notes for this conversation and my prep note, as well as a thank you note from Google for hosting it. I had no paper in my hotel room and put it all put it all right here. Adam, I saw your eyes light up when Astro said, put the idea on a shelf. You seem to react viscerally to that. Do you have a shelf where you have a lot of ideas?
Well, I'm a generalist by nature and a skill collector. And I think of all of the things that I have gathered into my head and my body over the years as arrows in a quiver that help me solve problems that are in front of me. And that I lit up because I love the idea of institutionalizing among a bunch of creative people what happens in my brain all the time. And it's really fun in here. It's like really great to learn that like what I learned riding a 6-foot unicycle applies to problem solving an engineering problem on Mythbusters because I learned about the center of gravity. Those are thrilling connections to make in here. I can only imagine what it's like to do with a whole bunch of brilliant people.
So, Astro, there's something that I've heard you talk about in other podcasts and talks where you talk about trying to get in the mind of a child. Tell me about why, for what purpose, and how.
First of all, I would just observe that we talk about creativity a lot like it's this grunting thing where you have to like force yourself to be creative, where you have to torture your employees until, the beatings will continue until creativity appears, right? Yeah. That's just not how it works when we're 5. We're all like fountains of ideas, and it flows from us so effortlessly. It's in all of us. And so creativity comes from humor. It comes from silliness. It does not come from grinding it out. It's not an effort that you can make. It's what happens when you stop making the effort. And so helping people connect to the beginner's mindset, where you can bring your skills with you to a problem, but none of your judgments and your assumptions. Letting all that stuff fall away, which is that feeling you have when you're 5 or 6 years old, where you're excited, where you're open-minded, where everything is possible, but having 50-year-old skills with you in that moment of sort of like emptiness in the best possible way. It's like controlled, purposeful naivete. That's what I'm hoping for all of us, which is why, for example, the only thing taped up on the door of my huddle is the tarot card of the Fool. Just to remind everybody that moment, that stepping off of the cliff with a smile on your face, that's what the act of creation is. And I think all 5, 6-year-olds, they do it naturally.
I completely agree with everything that Astro said. I also think we talked about where great ideas come from. And there's certainly this problem solution framework of, we've got a problem, let's go solve it, or let's propose this solution. Great ideas also come from as Adam says, the absurd, and being ridiculous and being silly and exploring what you feel like exploring that day. And actually, it's a relief for my brain often to try something that I don't have a particular thesis around a problem that it's going to solve, but it's fascinating and weird. Like, for example, right now I'm the artist in residence at the Exploratorium, and the only mandate that you have during the 2 years there is that you do something. And you could write, they're like, show up and make stuff. Maybe make stuff, but maybe make ideas. Maybe make words. Maybe make a brand new social structure, build a cult. Like, do whatever you want, right? They're like, you're here for 2 years, this is what it is to explore.
Build a cult?
Keep going. That was not in any of my contract paperwork, but I'm just saying that was something that I could have chosen to manifest. I did not. Well, come see the show. You'll never know. So one of the things that you can have a great idea could simply come from this process of making. And I think the making, Elizabeth Gilbert says this beautiful thing, which is to live a creative life is to approach the world with curiosity rather than fear. Full stop. That it needs to be nothing else. You don't need to have an 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. writing practice. You do need to have discipline, obviously, at a certain level, and we talked about how important I think suffering can be to this, or at least being able to encourage yourself to go through these phases of non-working, or everything is broken. But I think that creativity and great ideas can also simply come from a desire to play, experience, have fun, and be absurd and slightly weird.
I want to talk about play here for a second, because I think one of the elephants in the room we're not talking about is in a lot of workplaces, there's a difficulty in achieving the kind of freedom because of commerce, right? You're trying to deliver a product under a certain period of time. And I know there's been a lot of discussion over the past half decade about Google and the problems of vertically integrated monopolies, but my favorite vertically integrated monopoly is the Bell systems, because they built Bell Labs with the huge amount of money they had, and were able to decouple their scientists and engineers from the concerns of commerce. And I think that's similar to what X is also doing. You're not putting the pressure of delivery, it's the pressure of discovery, which is a fundamentally different practice.
Okay, so this all just sounds wonderful. Act like a child, there aren't rules, build a cult, take care. It's not really about working hard, it's about relaxing. A lot of the best inventions...
Also making a comeback, by the way.
I've noticed. A lot of the best inventions come from the United States Department of Defense, which doesn't follow these rules. Would they have just created the internet much faster if everybody wore R2-D2 costumes?
I mean, just to put a fine point on it, the Department of Defense, through DARPA, gives money to academics who've invented most of the things that I think you're pointing at, and not all of those, but if you go back and you look at the sort of Vint Cerfs and Alan Kays of the world who brought a lot of what we think of as modern computing into being, for example, they're playful people. Mm-hmm. They are playful, were, in the case of Alan Kay, playful people.
And so when you go in and you talk to the consulting firm, and everybody's in a suit and tie, and they, we have an innovation team over there, and they work from 6 in the morning until 9 o'clock at night. What do you tell them?
First of all, I didn't say that we don't have to deliver something. The question is, if you're playing a long game, and that's at least at X what we're doing, we're obsessed with playing that long game efficiently. So the question is not, you better create what we can harvest of value in the next day or month or even year. Yeah. But over a decade, we mean to produce enough value and enough goodness for the world that it justifies how we're showing up today. So we need to be purposeful about it, but that doesn't mean we need to be grim and focused and tunnel visioned about it. So there's a difference. I would say, what you want, if you are trying to explore efficiently, it's really easy to get moonshots, by the way, if you don't care about efficiency. You just find really high energy people, you throw money at them, you'll get some moonshots. It's just super not efficient. It's really easy to be sort of grimly efficient. If you just squeeze all the life out of an organization, it will be efficient, but there'll definitely be no magic left in it. It's finding that thing in the middle. That's what we're trying to chase at the Moonshot Factory, is how to be an explorer efficiently. And I think in very different ways, the 3 people here on stage, that's all 3 of our ethos.
And do you feel like there's another, one of the other interesting tensions when you read about where ideas come from is that some people believe that it's a moment of individual genius or insight, right? And you think about Tesla, you think about Edison, and the much more modern theory is that it's the way teams are structured and ideas flowing from it. Astro, you're clearly a teams guy. Adam, where are you?
I go back and forth between both. I love, it's funny, I love working with teams. I also love solving problems by myself. Part of that's a trauma response, but which among us is perfect? What can happen in a group of people trying to iterate something remarkable, and what they can find along the way, because it's never what you expect that you're looking for. But I have been in many groups where we achieved something, and the expansive feeling I have had in those moments make it feel like, oh, this is why I'm here. This is what it is to be a person.
Yeah.
5 of us are gathered around a table, and the same idea occurred to all of us at the same time, and the room got lighter, and we all have vertigo a little bit. That is a magnificent feeling, and that exceeds anything I've achieved alone at the workbench. So I also find that team building really important.
Katie?
Being more than the sum of your individual parts, I certainly subscribe to. I also think we do need to interrogate this idea of the solo inventor, because that person was raised, that person learned from someone else. right? They were able to build an identity for themselves or a niche that they worked in, whether it's Newton or Einstein or somebody else, because of a society that we have constructed around them. And so if you take team to be abstract in the standpoint that it's your relationship to others writ large, I don't think any person ever in the history of our species has been a solo inventor. Whoever was sitting there with a flint, or maybe not a flint, but trying to make fire, was not doing that as a solo person and being like, over there, made fire. It's like, no, this happened because this was a collective desire as a society. And so we do have this model of the solo inventor, but I think especially now in the way that we do science and engineering, everything is a collective team experience. And it also makes me really uncomfortable sometimes because people are challenging the things that I'm saying, or they're approaching things in different, or I get very impatient. And so there's a negotiation also involved when you're on a team that I think pushes your own thinking. Whereas me in my silo of my brain cage is like, I'm always right, and I always know what I'm doing, and everything's fine. So we need both.
I just want to say, one of the most fun parts of making Mythbusters was breaking the stories. And one of my favorite parts of that was I would write the first outline out on a whiteboard. And I'd go, okay, obviously the first experiment is this because this is the way most people think about this. And then someone on the crew would be like, I think of it totally opposite. Mm-hmm. And that, like, I remember the first time that happened, I was like, oh, this is running off the rails. And then every other time I was like, excellent, now we're starting. Now we've started, yeah.
And Astro, you've had this organization for 15 years. How do you structure teams now in order to maximize idea flow and the quality of new ideas? How do you structure teams now versus how you did it 15 years ago? What have you learned?
You know, I think that we're much better at supporting these teams than we were 15 years ago. You know, if I can come back to that dichotomy that I was describing before, from sort of like total chaos, where you'll get moonshots, but you won't get them efficiently, and like total efficiency, but you definitely won't get any moonshots, and trying to find this thing in the middle. You know, I think over the last 15 years, X's arc has been, like, we had to start with the moonshots, with the magic, and then sort of slowly we've been trying to turn up the rigor dials in ways that improve our efficiency, improve the support of these teams, but that don't sort of kill off the underlying kind of creativity and opportunity for us to surprise each other that happens in that journey. So that's what the last 15 years feels like. So as an example, I think there was more of a fire and forget attitude about the teams in the very early days. Hey, you seem smart, go work on the teleporter. Bye, call me, once a quarter and tell me how it's going. That's actually a horrible way to mentor them. And it turns out, if the two of you are gonna, maybe you're gonna go work on the teleporter project and you're gonna go work on the time machine project, and then you barely talk to each other, even though you're on the same maybe central team. What if the two of you both went and worked on the teleporter together, and then with half your time, and then half your time you go work on the time machine together? You guys have more fun because you're working together. You learn from each other because you're working together, and you're transplanting ideas much faster between the teleporter team and the time machine team. That's an example of how you can start to architect things like having it be more fun, having us learn faster together, transplanting ideas between the teams. So it's those kinds of things at X that we've sort of built into the structure without saying, here's how you have to do a teleporter. We're trying to sort of get the superstructure to be more supportive of these teams being able, in a pretty flexible way, to change what they're doing as they sort of re-understand their problem or their technology.
Shouldn't you build the time machine team first? You can go back and buy NVIDIA stock and fund the teleporter machine team?
I always use the time machine team, and I always think, like, you know what, if we ever get it started, it'll be done by yesterday, so it's probably a bad example to use, but...
Okay, but more seriously, so you have a good idea, you have a good team, you're going. It's a question for all of you. How do you structure a good experiment? Like, how do you choose the order of things you're going to do? Let's say you're building a teleporter, right? What do you do first? Like, what have you learned about how you structure it?
So what we say at X, we have a joke, which is that if you're going to train a monkey to stand on the top of a 10-foot pedestal and recite Shakespeare, should you build the pedestal first, or should you train the monkey? Obviously, in this extreme case, you should try to train the monkey first. Because if you can train the monkey, we know we can build the pedestal. And if you build the pedestal first, a little part of you feels like you're half done. It's more than half the weight.
right?
But you have 0% burn down the risk. And what we're doing, at least at X, we are all about burning down the risk. That's 100% of our job. If all of the risk is whether you can train the monkey, you should do that first.
Do either of you want to defend building the pedestal?
People are working on human-animal translation, by the way, using AI, so it will not be that far in the future that we have monkeys that could learn Shakespeare. I want that to be on the podcast.
No, and I'm really not sure we want to know what animals think of us. I mean,
because they'll be hostile and they'll be upset, or because once we can communicate with animals, it will just change the nature of an animal, and the whole relationship with the natural world will shift.
Well, I was talking to Asa Raskin about this, and we were talking about poison ivy, and he was like, it's really shitty for poison ivy that it's named after its worst quality. And then he's found himself wondering, what would whales call human beings if they named them after their worst quality? They'd call them genocide monkeys.
All right, well, on that note, let's shift up. All right, so we have 3 genocide monkeys on stage, but you're all optimistic about the future. Tell me how you're thinking about, maybe Katie, I'll start with you. You said something interesting to me when we were walking in, which is that you think there's a realistic chance that folks your age of folks in the audience will live to be 130. How does that change your perspective on what to invent? Because really, if you thought the world was going to, if your PDM for the next 5 years was 100%, you'd think about things very differently. How does your sense of longevity change the way you think about inventions?
We, as humans, have doubled our lifespan in the last 100 years. So we used to die in our late 30s, and now if you're lucky, you can live until you're 75, 80 years old, and it's for a host of things, right? Antibiotics, we've got better, we don't fight as many wars maybe as we used to in the same way. We eat different kinds of foods. We're able to make sure that we don't die from certain kinds of diseases. So we were able to double our lifespan.
We have Waymos, too.
We have Waymos.
Run you over nearly as often.
And there are Waymos in Austin, which was crazy. I got goosebumps when I saw that. So we've doubled our lifespan in about 100 years. So if you add another 50% onto that-ish, give or take, maybe it could get me to 130, right? So, and that's because we now have all of these interesting new therapies coming around where we have therapies for cancer and some colleagues like Eric Nguyen, who has not quite gotten that far yet, but is making new strands of DNA using large language models. So we don't even know where we're headed in terms of longevity and humans being able to, like the ship of Theseus, replace certain parts of our body and then continue to subsist and live. That's ostensibly, for me, a little less than 100 years from now. So how do I think about innovation on that timeline? For me, it almost seems like a speculative exercise of, well, what's the world I would want to live in? What could I imagine or envision for myself that would seem empowered, pluralistic, curiosity-inducing, equitable, safe? And so if I think about innovation in that way, it almost seems like a social innovation. And then what are the technologies that I could engineer that would create that kind of social innovation? And one example, especially for me, is in working in robotics. There's so much change in the demographic distribution right now because we're not having as many kids, and people are living longer, and so we're going to have these populations where you have large groups of older people and not as many young people to take care of them and also to labor and add, to the GDP of the economy and things like that. And so I want robots of the future that are not only capable of moving things around in factories, but can also not necessarily be companions, but caretaking. So they can do parts of the caretaking process, like ensure that somebody's hydrated well enough or that they're safe inside of their home. And that would be a vision of a future robot that I would want to build. And that requires not just great engineering, but also being an emotionally competent person who can imbue machines with a sense of safety and agency for the humans that use them.
Astra, is there anything that you believe that is as, I want to say outlandish, but as optimistic as Katie's view that we're going to live to be 130, that changes the way you think about invention? Tell me something that you believe about the next 50 years that most of the people here disagree with.
That's a high bar. I mean, let me start.
They've all had mimosas, so it's actually harder than you thought.
I'm actually curious how many people in this room think that we could live to 130. Yeah. So maybe it's not that controversial. There are lots of hands raised.
About half the hands in the room went up.
Right.
I mean, so I'm not sure that we're going to, or that that's the right thing to chase, but I want to come back to optimism.
Yeah.
I think some people hear optimism as a prediction about the future. So if I'm optimistic, then I must think it's at least 51% likely that the future will be good. That is not why I'm optimistic. I suspect it's not why they're optimistic either. I believe, X believes, that approaching the future from a positive stance is more likely to manifest something positive than if we start on the back foot. If we assume that the future is grim, we're more likely to make things that manifest that grimness. So that's where I think the optimism is coming from, at least for X, is that we want to be adding value, goodness to the world. That's sort of our frame at the Moonshot Factory. And let me give you a specific example of something I think less than half the people here would say. I believe that the 20th century was mostly defined by silicon. I think when we look backwards, cars and birth control and several other things aside, the computer will still be the thing that defined the 20th century. I believe the 21st century, artificial intelligence is obviously going to have a good run. I believe that humanity learning to program biology moving from a science to an engineering discipline will be at least as important in the 21st century as computers coming onto the scene in the 20th century was.
Don't you think that a byproduct of that will be that we live until 130, though?
Possibly. I just think that there's so many people who are chasing longevity in unhealthy ways that betray their personal issues that I worry about them and about the whole sort of subgenre that's going after that.
There are massive class issues involved as
yes.
well.
I don't think, but I think when you have, I think when biology becomes a computing discipline, much like when we got antibiotics, this extension of human lifespan is not because of some weird fringe obsession about living longer, but it's literally just a logical outcome.
And you may well be right, and I'm super happy if we end up extending people's bodies as long, important side note, as we extend the health of their brains at the same rate. Because right now people's brains are ending before their bodies are ending. That's doing no one any favors, so we need to do both. I would be super happy if it happened. I'm just worried about the way it's being chased right now.
Adam, do you have a belief about the future that you think most of the people in the room disagree with, or maybe don't realize?
Yeah. I repeat that that's a high bar. About the next 50 years, the next 100 years. I mean, I don't know what's going on right now, but I know there'll be a retraction from it at some point in the next half generation.
Well, let's frame it differently. We have 3 minutes left, so maybe we have a lot of people who are listening to this podcast, and they're thinking about the next thing that they build, or they're thinking about the next invention they make, the next experiment they run. What is some advice you'd like to end with on how they should think about the next step in their journey? People who are listening to this podcast are surely very curious and very interested in building things. Katie?
I got some great advice about this, which is don't say no to yourself before someone else says it to you. Before I got a PhD in engineering, I was a professional dancer. And so I used to stand next to 400 other women in a room where there were 3 jobs, and we would give it our best shot, right? And you would see who would get the job. So when everyone always says to me, oh, mechanical engineering is so hard, I'm like, have you ever auditioned in a leotard? Do you know what that feels like? So I think there's this feeling of don't say no to yourself. Maybe don't necessarily filter your ideas before you have even attempted the first modicum of what that idea could be like. And then I think the second piece of advice that I would give, we've talked a lot about fun and playfulness, but there's also something to be said about excellence and being a true student, a lifelong learner who is willing to be humble and always allow yourself to learn from any avenue such that you become better and better at your craft. I don't think anyone I speak to who is a builder or an engineer thinks that they have mastered it all, thinks that they are the expert. They are constantly humbled by the awe and majesty of the things that you do not know. And so the first one I, again, would reiterate is don't say no to yourself. Don't give yourself the limitations that simply don't exist. And then the second one is allow yourself to be humble and curious and constantly in pursuit of more and greater excellence, and you'll uncover fascinating things along the way.
Adam?
I think we all have this cultural idea of the artist as a person sitting there looking into the world, trying to discover something about their own point of view about it, trying to communicate something about it, and being open to an experience that might take them in a new direction. I don't think we have a cultural idea of an engineer working that way, but they do, and they must if any engineer is going to do any important work. They have to have that same type of openness that we ascribe to an artist, because it's the same process.
What I'm going to say sort of rhymes a bit with what Katie said. You know, at X we say you have to have really large amounts of audacity and really large amounts of humility in order to take moonshots, which, maybe to answer your question, I hope that for everyone at X and for everyone in the world who wants to go do something that's going to benefit themselves, their families, their communities, the whole world, they start by saying, if I knew that whatever I was going to do was going to succeed, I get that pre-promise to me. How high could I reach? That's what audacity is, right? And then, right after you start, if you know that this is almost certainly wrong, how would you go about efficiently discovering that you're not on the right path? If God came down and whispered to you, you're definitely wrong, but you have to figure out why. And that's the humility. I think when you get large amounts of both things at the same time, something magical happens.
All right, well, that was a really beautiful ending from 3 Genocide Monkeys. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be on stage with you all.
That was awesome.
Thank you, everybody, and please listen to the Moonshots podcast. All right. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Nick.